A Runaway Tale by Jacqueline Westlake. Chapter 1. He knew they'd be looking for him, but Zig was an expert at evasion, and on the chance that he was caught he could fight. Father had seen to that. So pause for a second and answer this question. What does the word evasion mean? Write a definition, then underline or highlight the words in the text you use to infer that meaning. Don't forget to shade the question with the correct color to tell me what type of question it is. It was a cold, gray day. The sun hid behind a thick wall of clouds and the breeze carried a tinge of winter. It blew through the tall thicket of trees where Zig hid. He shivered. He was used to living outside, preferred it even, but he was not accustomed to going without food, and Zig was starving. It had been at least 3 days since his last meal, and his stomach groaned in protest. Hiding out in the woods wasn't going to be a long-term solution. Fighter or not, Zig wasn't much of a hunter, and he needed to eat something soon. He'd do anything for some chicken or bacon. Bacon. Zig pushed his anxiety about being spotted aside and emerged from the safety of the forest. Going into town was risky, but he didn't have a choice. Curling up and dying just wasn't in his nature, and he certainly couldn't go back home, not that he wanted to. A small 2-lane highway led the way to town. Gravel crunched under Zig's feet as he carefully navigated the shoulder, being sure to stay close to the woods that sandwiched the road. It wasn't a long walk, but he took his time. It was best to avoid drawing attention to himself. He walked several miles until a sleepy trailer park, the first sign of civilization, gave way to neatly kept suburbs. It was early. He didn't see anyone except a lone paperboy whizzing by on his bike. He'd been here before, when he was very young. That was a long time ago. Most of his life had been spent on Father's land, and in the basement. Zig hated thinking about the basement. So pause for a second and answer question 2. Make sure you use a complete sentence. Why do you think Zig is hiding and on the run? Once you've answered the question, don't forget to take your colored pencil and shade the question to show what the question type is. All right, we'll keep going. A sprinkler kicked on, catching Zig in its crossfire. He probably needed a bath, but not like this. It was that kind of neighborhood, the type of place with freshly cut grass, automatic sprinkler systems, paperboys, and locked doors. The gentle pieces of his soul, the ones that remained, quietly longed to walk through the door of one of these houses and into the loving, open arms of a family. And maybe some bacon. Part of Zig still longed for a home. He needed to get downtown. That's where the food would be. He stuffed weak thoughts of family and warmth and delicious treats down and pushed himself forward. He didn't have much further to go. All right, pause. Question 3. Do you agree with Zig that thinking about comforting memories with family are weak thoughts? Why or why not? Make sure you answer using complete sentences, and then make sure you take your colored pencil and shade the question to show the question type. Brick buildings and flickering streetlights dotted the simple downtown avenues. There were more people here, opening shops for morning, emptying trash bins, and exchanging friendly hellos. Zig stood on a corner taking it all in. A part of him longed to run up to these strangers and ask for help, but he didn't know who he could trust. It was best to stay out of sight. The smell of freshly baked bread and grilled breakfast meats tortured his stomach. No more hesitating. He needed to find food. He made his way to a small alley behind a row of restaurants and carefully picked his way down the narrow, dumpster-lined path. He knew he'd find someone's leftovers here, and he certainly wasn't above scrounging through garbage for a meal. Sure enough, he found a pile of burnt muffins that had fallen out of an overly stuffed trash bin. He ate them ravenously. As Zig was preparing to devour his 4th muffin, the back door of the bakery swung open. He froze. A tall, portly man in a stained white apron stared down at him. "Hey, get out of here," the man yelled. Zig didn't hesitate. He ran, hoping the man hadn't recognized him. If he had, it wouldn't be long before Father showed up. All right, question 4. Why do you think Zig doesn't want Father to show up? Make sure you answer your question using a complete sentence, and then take your colored pencil, shade the question to show the question type. Chapter 2. A full belly and a fading rush of adrenaline are enough to exhaust anyone, and Zig was no exception. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep, but he woke with a start. His makeshift hideout in the downtown park bushes wasn't nearly as secure as the forest. Zig was suddenly acutely aware of that. He needed to move. He crept out from under the bush and stretched his legs. Stifling a yawn, he began walking towards the suburbs. If he could make it back to his wooded hideout, he could regroup and make a longer-term plan. Sneaking into town every couple of days wasn't going to work. He'd be no freer than when he was with Father. That's when he heard it. A large, black van screeched to a halt behind him. Zig looked over his shoulder in time to see 2 men in dark clothing jump out of the vehicle. They were holding weapons. He'd been found. Zig ran. He was quite the sprinter and could easily outpace just about anyone, especially Father. As he ran, Zig flashed back to the escape, the moment he became a runaway. At first, Father had kept him in chains like the others, but with time, Zig had gained his father's confidence and was trusted to spend more time outside on his own. Being Father's most prized fighter had its privileges, but Zig was terrified. He'd seen others brutally punished for a lot less than running away, and he wasn't sure he could risk it. He planned his escape gradually, first by testing the boundaries of where he could roam. He'd disappear into the woods surrounding Father's compound for just a few minutes at a time. Proof that he could be trusted to come home. He began to truly know the forest. He knew all the best hiding spots. He knew the places where the soft forest floor and thick brush would allow him to move silently, invisibly. There in the woods, Zig allowed himself to dream of freedom. He may never have gone through with his plan had it not been for that day. He'd been slinking through the woods when Father emerged from the basement. He was dragging one of Zig's brothers. Zig watched silently, helplessly, as Father beat his brother until he no longer moved. Zig was sure he was dead, and he knew that someday, if he stayed, he would be too. So he ran, just like he was running now. Zig slowed his pace, and he reached the outskirts of town. Panting, he looked over his shoulder and saw no one. He breathed a sigh of relief. Gotcha. Zig felt a thick, coarse rope slide around his body. A rough hand slammed over his mouth. A surge of sheer terror washed over him. It was the men from the van. He thrashed violently as a restraint tightened around his neck. Zig was fierce, but the men were too strong. They were pros, and he was outnumbered. But he kept fighting, yelling, as he was forced into the back of the unmarked van, even after the door slammed shut. Then everything went black. All right, question 5. Why can you infer that Father isn't actually Zig's real parent? Describe a detail from the text and explain why that detail allowed you to make that inference. Make sure you answer using a complete sentence. Make sure you cite a specific example. And make sure you go back and shade the question with the right color to show the question type. All right, now you have question 6 as well. So if Father isn't actually Zig's parent, what relationship do you think Zig and his father have? Make sure that you answer using a complete sentence. And make sure you go back with a colored pencil and shade the question so I know you know the question type. Chapter 3. Zig woke to find himself in a stark, square cell. His head pounded from whatever drugs the men had used to sedate him. But that was nothing compared to the pit in his stomach. Just like that, he'd lost his freedom again. From the bars of his cage, Zig tried to look around. He was in some sort of facility lined with identical concrete cells. Each cell housed a prisoner like him. He didn't recognize anyone. He needed to get out of there. Zig began carefully tracing the walls of his small cell, looking for cracks, holes, or weak spots. He clawed at the corners and dug at the floor. Okay, so pause for a second. Question 7. Name another movie, book, or TV show that this scene reminds you of. Explain why that movie, book, or TV show and this story are similar. Explain why they're the same. Make sure you answer using complete sentences. Make sure you take a colored pencil, go back and shade the question so I know you know the question type. Okay, keep going. It was solid cement. Panic began to set in. Zig was trapped, and he wanted answers. He yelled at the top of his lungs. He pounded against the bars of the cell. Men in dark clothes, his captors, passed by, acting as if they didn't hear him at all. They talked amongst themselves in a language he couldn't understand. Zig's head spun with endless questions. Why was he here? What did they want with him? Did Father know he was here? He didn't know how much time had passed. Eventually, a man with a serious face and a stocky build appeared in front of Zig's cell. He slid a tray of food under the bars, turned on his heel, and walked away. Zig threw the tray across the room. Question 8. What can you infer about Zig's personality because he throws the food tray across the room? Make sure you write using a complete sentence. Make sure you take your colored pencil, shade the question so I know you know the question type. Maybe it was the terror, hunger, or exhaustion, or some combination of it all, but Zig was done being tough, at least for tonight. He stopped pacing the length of his tiny cell and collapsed into the thin, scratchy mat in the corner. Heaving a deep sigh, he finally let the weight of it all go, and he began to cry. Question 9. Do you think that crying makes a person weak? Why or why not? Make sure you really explain why you have that opinion, and then use a complete sentence, and make sure you go back and shade the question with your colored pencil so I know you know the type of question. Chapter 4. He never did find out why he was there. The days became routine, so much so that they were difficult to keep track of. Mornings began with a brief walk outside, with his restraints tightly fastened, of course, and a trip to the bathroom. Then a dry, flavorless breakfast back in his cell. Sometimes his captors would forget about him and Zig would be forced to go in the corner of his cage. He passed most of the time staring out through the bars of his cell, watching his captors come and go, bringing new prisoners in and old ones out. He never knew where they went. Some would come back, but others he never saw again. Either way, no one ever talked to him about it. The nights were the worst. The facility was cold, damp, and eerily silent, save for the stray whimper of another lonely inmate. After his evening walk, bathroom break, and dinner scraps, Zig would lay on his mat, willing sleep to take him away. But first, he usually thought about the past. Before Father, before the ring, before the forest and his capture, Zig had been happy. He'd once been surrounded by brothers and sisters and a mother who loved them, a family. He'd played in the yard carefree. He'd wrestled with his siblings and napped in the warm sun. He was different then, but that was before. That was all so long ago. Zig would never forget the night Father broke into his home and lured him from his bed. If only he'd known what Father wanted with him, what he would do when he got Zig into the basement, Zig would have fought like hell. All right, question 10. How do you know for sure that Father isn't Zig's actual parent now? Make sure you answer using a complete sentence and be sure to go back and use a colored pencil to shade the question to show the question type. But Zig had gone willingly, a gullible youngster. Could he ever be happy again? Not here, that was for sure. This place was gray and cold. Loud, harsh, and hopeless. Why was he even here? Did they know how many he'd killed? Perhaps this was his punishment. He certainly deserved it. Chapter 5. Zig was restless. He itched to fight. He would snap at the other inmates as they passed his cell, trying to scare them. He could tell who had been in a ring, like him. Only a few. They were the ones who triggered him the most. Self-restraint wasn't his strong suit. Once in a while, a scrappy prisoner would give him a reaction, and even though Zig couldn't get to him, the rush of it all made him feel alive. All right, question 11. Write a definition for the word scrappy. Then go back and highlight or underline words from the text that help you come up with that definition. Make sure you use a complete sentence. Make sure you go back with a colored pencil and shade the question so you know the question type. And don't forget that step about going back and highlighting or underlining your evidence. Fighting for Zig was complicated. When Father first took him in, he'd hated it. He was terrified. But refusing to fight didn't spare him pain. Either his opponent would issue a punishing beatdown, or worse, Father would later. With time and practice, Zig became great. He was a natural, the perfect combination of strength, stealth, and wits. He was light on his feet and could easily anticipate his opponent's next move. Like he was psychic, Father had said. He zigged when his sparring partner zagged. That's how he got his name. Question 12. Explain how Zig got his name. Make sure you summarize in your own words using complete sentences. Make sure you go back and shade the question. Zig won every fight Father entered him in. He crushed every opponent. He even killed a few, he was sure, but he never saw any of them again. The spectators, though, he came to know quite well. They were regulars, all of them, mostly loud, drunk, raucous men who got their jollies watching youngsters fight. And Zig was their favorite. They cheered him on wildly and celebrated his wins. They basked in the defeat of Zig's opponents. In those moments, Zig loved them. But later, back in his room, as he recovered from his injuries or thought about whoever he'd hurt that night, Zig hated himself. He felt like a monster, and he was trapped. It was possible, Zig thought, to love something and loathe it all at once. That was fighting. It would always be a part of him. Chapter 6. He looked tough. He knew that. Despite his youth, Zig was all muscle. Short but stout, with a scarred face that he'd once been told was handsome, dark features and soulful brown eyes. His build, his tough exterior, had served him well when he'd fought for Father in the basement, when he'd become champion of the ring. Here in this new place, one sudden move could make the most of his captor's jump. And Zig liked it that way. It was a small piece of freedom, a distant feeling of control over his world. At least he could scare them. But Zig had also developed an uneasy trust with a man called Jim. At least as much as one can trust a person who holds them against their will. Jim had a kind face and a calm demeanor. He didn't manhandle Zig like some of the other captors had. He gave Zig space. Against his better judgment, Zig liked him, and he thought Jim might like him too. Chapter 13. Why does Zig like and trust Jim? Explain it in your own words, then highlight or underline the evidence you used to form that conclusion. So make sure you answer using complete sentences. If you need to go down towards the bottom of the page to have a little more room to write, do that. Don't forget the step where you go back and highlight or underline your evidence. And don't forget to shade the question so that I know you know the question type. Jim called Zig Tiger, and he had no idea why, but he didn't really care. He could be Tiger. All right, question 14. Why do you think Jim calls Zig Tiger? Make sure you answer using a complete sentence. Make sure you take a colored pencil and shade the question to show the question type. Leaving Zig behind didn't sound like such a bad idea anyway. His life here was rigid and cold, but at least they left him alone. Father hadn't shown up yet, so maybe he was safe here. And there was food, even if it was bland. Chapter 7. Jim became Zig's primary handler. He would bring Zig breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. Sometimes he'd even sneak Zig scraps of bacon or bread. With time, Zig stopped protesting when Jim attached the restraints. They'd take a quiet walk to the bathroom or around the yard of the facility. They never really spoke. Jim wouldn't understand what Zig was saying anyway. Once, Zig slipped out of his restraints and bolted, running faster than he'd ever run before. But the fence surrounding the perimeter of his prison was too tall and he couldn't make it over. He was quickly caught. But Jim didn't punish him. Occasionally, Zig had to endure a mortifying bath or medical examination. Worse, he'd sometimes be led into a room filled with waiting strangers who would poke and prod him. He never learned why, but Jim was always there, guiding Zig through whatever plans the day held for him, mundane, humiliating, or otherwise. I know, Jim would say as he legged Zig back to his cell. This isn't easy. Chapter 8. He lost track of the days. It had probably been several months since he was captured, robbed of his freedom, but he couldn't be sure. Jim's visits weren't always predictable. Today he showed up early, after lunch but before dinner. Let's go, Tiger. Jim attached Zig's restraints. Together they walked calmly down the noisy hall. Zig knew the drill. Strangers would be waiting behind a big metal door ready to examine him. Before the door swung open, he felt a familiar pit in his stomach, afraid that his father had finally tracked him down. He'd be brutally punished for running away, then promptly entered in a fight. As soon as his wounds had healed sufficiently, of course. A man and a woman were waiting on the other side of the door. They looked young, clean, and untouched by hardship. They might as well have been from another planet. Zig retreated to his usual corner and stared them down, gritting his teeth. "This is Tiger," Jim said as he settled into a chair. "He's not much of a social butterfly." All right, question 15. What does it mean if you call somebody a social butterfly? Make sure you answer using a complete sentence. Make sure that you go back and take your colored pencil and shade the question to show that you know the question type. The woman smiled and knelt to look at Zig in the eye. "Hi, Tiger," she purred gently. She seemed kind, but that didn't mean anything to Zig. He looked away. He hung back in the corner, watching the man and woman talk with his captor. Zig didn't speak their language, but he'd picked up a few words during his captivity, and he knew they were talking about him. "He doesn't get along well with others," Jim said. "He's been through a lot," the man replied. The woman nodded in agreement. "He doesn't seem very interested in either of you," Jim observed. "It'll take time," said the woman. "Well, he's all yours then if you'll have him," Jim replied with a shrug. The woman turned and addressed Zig directly. "Do you want to come with us?" she asked, as if he had a choice. Zig just stared. "It's your lucky day," Jim said. All right, question 16. Where do you think the man and woman are going to take Zig? What do you think they will do with him? Make sure you answer using complete sentences, and make sure you go back and take your colored pencil and highlight the question to show that you know the type of question. Chapter 9. Zig, still in restraints, was led out of the facility by the man and woman, who walked lightly, happily towards the parking lot. The fresh air and new scenery should have been thrilling. But Zig was broken. He'd been in the facility for so long, wondering what the purpose of it all was. He just couldn't bring himself to care. He'd come to peace with the fact that his life simply wasn't his own. His fate was in the hands of others. Whatever destiny he was heading toward next, he was sure it was nothing to get excited about. But he might miss Jim a little, he thought. The man opened the door to a small gray car. He gestured for Zig to get in the back seat. Zig did so begrudgingly. He allowed the woman to fasten a soft, loose restraint around his chest. Then she gently touched his head. Zig leaned into it ever so slightly, surprised by how good a kind hand felt. It had been a long time since he'd felt anything like it. Sometimes he wondered if he ever really had. After she finished fastening his restraints, the woman dug around in her bag and pulled out a piece of bacon. She handed it to Zig, who promptly gobbled it down. It would take more than bacon to win him over, but it was a start. He wondered if Jim had told these people how much he loved the stuff. The woman closed the door and climbed into the front seat. The man started the car, and just like that, they drove away. Away from the prison, away from Jim, away from the ghost of father. It had been months since he'd been in a car. How much time had passed since his capture? He couldn't be sure. The woman rolled the windows down. Zig felt a surge of excitement as the fresh air whooshed all around him. He breathed in the infinite sense of the outside world. He felt himself relax just a little. They drove for a while. The man and woman talked amongst themselves, but the woman would turn and check on Zig every once in a while, smiling her kind smile. Zig settled into the soft seat. He didn't know why, but he felt relieved. The open window called to him. Testing the pull of his restraints, Zig crept toward it. Climbing up on the door's armrest, he gingerly stuck his head out the window. A rush of cool air washed across his face. His ears flew back with the force of the wind. He felt alive, free even, and for the first time in a long time, his tail wagged. The woman looked back and smiled. She placed her hand over the man's and said, "I think we should call him Lucky." Zig liked that. Number 17. List one thing that the man and the woman do to tell you that they will probably be kind to Zig. Make sure you answer using a complete sentence and make sure you use your colored pencil to highlight the question. And question 18. Surprise! If you hadn't already figured it out, this story is about a dog, not a person. Now that you know that, go back through the story. List 3 clues from the text that tell you the story is about a dog. All right, once you've done that, make sure you shade your question so that you can show that you know the question type. And then go back and check over your work. Make sure you've shaded all of the questions the correct color. Make sure you've started all of your sentences with capital letters and ended with punctuation. Make sure you have capitalized the names as you've gone through, like Zig or Jim. And just double check spelling and make sure you've answered every question.